The wind knew the way. It had curled over mountains older than memory, skimmed the ice-laced edges of distant glaciers, and now danced through the northern woods, stirring pine needles like secrets. It whispered between tree trunks, brushing against, bark scarred by claws and storms, and carried with it the scent of snow. The first flake touched down just as dusk broke open the sky. Annie Rivers stood on the edge of the ridge, hands buried in the warmth of her parka, the stiff edges of her sleeves brushing against her cheeks. Her breath made clouds that hung between her and the landscape, a veil of heat fading into the cold. Below her, the forest fell away into a sweep of black and white, shadow and snow braided into the hollows, the kind of beauty that made you still. Her boots were heavy with mud and frost, each step forward crunching like brittle bones. She hadn't meant to hike this far, only to check the trail cameras after last night's snowfall, but the path had pulled her deeper. It always did. She worked alone now and preferred it that way. Biologist by training, wildlife researcher by profession, she had built her reputation tracking lynx populations through the northern ranges. But in the past 2 years, she'd stopped publishing, stopped attending conferences, and had taken a grant few wanted, a solitary winter-long field study of predatory movement patterns near the Old Hollow. It was, by many accounts, a dead zone. But Annie knew better. She crouched now, near a torn patch of earth, a disturbance, faint and recent. Her gloved fingers brushed back snow, revealing a print pressed clean into the soil below. Bare. Juvenile, she estimated. Weeks old, at most. Not from a pack, but from something that had survived the cold too early, too alone. She rose, slowly, a prickling under her skin she couldn't name. This was no ordinary sign. A faint cry cracked the silence behind her. Annie spun. It wasn't a bird or a coyote or the whistle of pine. It was higher, smaller. A voice caught in the air, a sound full of ache. She moved toward it, carefully, boots breaking crusted snow. The trees grew dense, limbs clawing low like gnarled fingers. Another sound, louder this time, almost like a cub. Annie's pulse tripped. She followed the noise, breaking into a jog, mind racing through variables. A bear cub, crying. That wasn't normal behavior. Not unless. The forest opened into a narrow clearing, and she saw them. The mother lay half buried in snow, blood spread like ink beneath her. Her fur was matted, frozen in places. She was huge, an adult black bear, breathing in shallow puffs, her flank rising and falling with effort. A wound tore across her side, jagged and dark, likely from a poacher's trap or worse. And beside her, pressed close, was her cub. Tiny, trembling eyes too big for his head. He whined again, pawing gently at her neck, as if to wake her. She didn't move. Annie's heart folded in on itself. He wasn't just staying with her, he was guarding her. She stepped forward, slow. "Hey there," she whispered, crouching low. The cub froze, hackles raised, tiny growl vibrating his ribs. He was no bigger than a husky, but the way he stood, defiant, quaking, he might as well have been a lion. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said. Her voice was low, the tone she used when easing frightened animals into carriers, or calming down fawns stuck in fences. "I want to help." The mother stirred, a breath breaking free of her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, met Annie's, and then closed again. "She's not going to last long," Annie muttered. She pulled her pack off and reached for her emergency kit. She had sedatives, field gauze, antibiotics, enough to stabilize her if the cold didn't claim her first. But as she approached, the cub moved in front of her mother, growling again. He wasn't going anywhere. "Okay," Annie said. "Then, you're both coming with me." It took everything she had, 2 tarps, a makeshift sled, and nearly 3 hours in deepening snow to get them back to her field station, a cabin more metal than wood tucked beneath the hill line. She wrapped the mother bear tight, turned the heat to max, and laid the cub beside her in a nest of blankets. He didn't let her near at first, Not until the mother licked his ear faintly, a breathless command that made him relent. The first night passed in silence. Annie slept upright in a chair, fingers wrapped around a mug of black coffee, watching them breathe. In the dark, she whispered to no one, "What are you doing here?" The cub stirred, just slightly, and let out a tiny sigh. She didn't know yet, but that was the beginning of everything. The snow didn't stop. By the second day, it had layered thick over the roof of Annie's cabin, muffling the world until even the birdsong seemed to come from underwater. It turned everything pale and soundless, like living in the ribcage of a sleeping god. But inside, there was heat and breath and something else now, something like a fragile hope. The bear mother had made it through the night, though barely. Her breathing remained shallow, pain-racked, and effortful. The wound along her side was deep, possibly from a snare wire, Annie now suspected, given the frayed, evenly spaced laceration. Poachers still ran quiet lines through these woods. She'd reported traps before. This one nearly killed something magnificent. The cub hadn't left her side once. He was small, maybe 4 months old at best. His coat, coarse with dampness, had lightened in patches from the warmth of the fire, but frost still clung stubbornly to the tips of his ears. Annie had set a space for them in the corner of the main room, just left of the old stove, where she did most of her cooking. She laid out thick thermal blankets, an emergency warming pad, and, after the first few warning growls, a shallow dish of boiled rice and broth. The cub eyed it for hours before touching it. Even then, he only ate after his mother's nose had nudged it once, a tiny, unconscious motion in her sleep. He sniffed it, whimpered, then ate greedily. When it was gone, he curled into her side again and licked her ear until his own eyes closed. Annie watched all of this in near reverence. She didn't name them, not yet. That wasn't her way. Labels got in the way of clarity. These were wild animals, not pets. But still, the shape of her thoughts formed words around them. Guardian, mother, brave little sentinel. And she kept writing, page after page, in her field journal, documenting not just their behaviors, but how it felt to see such fierce, wordless loyalty. How a cub, who barely knew the world, had refused to run from death. He stayed, she wrote one night, her hand trembling slightly as wind battered the windows. He stayed when instinct must have told him to run. She couldn't stop thinking about it. Annie had studied maternal behavior in mammals for a decade. She'd written about everything from scent bonding to vocal imprinting. But what she was watching now, this wasn't textbook survivalism. This was something else. The cub wasn't just obeying instinct. He was choosing. She had seen it in his eyes over and over, and she knew what it meant to choose to stay. When Annie was 17, she'd stayed too long. Her mother had been sick, pancreatic cancer. Her decline was brutal and fast. By the time the hospice nurse suggested letting go, Annie had wrapped herself so tightly in her mother's arms that she couldn't imagine breathing without that warmth. She'd skipped school for 2 weeks, missed the big scholarship interview, lost her spot in the top 5%. But she'd stayed until the last breath. And after, something had changed in her. A wire had snapped or fused. She didn't cry easily anymore. Didn't allow herself indulgence in sentimentality. She became precision incarnate, logical, dedicated, detached. Yet here was this cub, baring tiny teeth at the world, daring it to come closer, daring it to take what was his. He reminded her of that part of herself she had tried to bury. 3 days passed. The mother bear showed signs of slight improvement, breathing steadier, the fever receding. She was still sedated for pain twice daily, a careful dosage based on weight and metabolic estimate. Her wound needed daily redressing, which she endured in silence, only flinching when the alcohol met the raw edges of tissue. The cub had begun to watch Annie closely during the care routine, not with suspicion, but curiosity. He followed her with his eyes, tracked her hands. He sniffed at the gauze after she discarded it, memorized the smell of the iodine. When she poured clean water into the bowl, he looked to her first, waiting for some silent permission, as if they'd reached a point where he knew, she is not threat. Annie had never felt more honored by anything in her life. That night, it snowed, again. And in the firelight, she saw the cub rise from his mother's side and take 3 slow, tentative steps toward her chair. He sniffed the leg of it, looked up at her, then curled himself into a ball beneath the table. Not too far from his mother, not too close to the stranger, but somewhere between, somewhere in the middle. Annie stared at him until the fire burned low and the silence folded back around them. By the end of the week, the mother bear stood, only briefly. But it was enough. She had rolled awkwardly onto her other side, huffed once, and, using her good limbs, pushed herself to her feet. Her legs shook. The cub let out a low, urgent whine and pressed his nose to her chest, but she held her weight. Her gaze found Annie, steady and unblinking. There was no gratitude in it. That would have been anthropomorphic projection. No, this was something else. A simple, primal recognition. You helped. I see you. But we are not yours. Annie nodded slowly, whispering, understood. She radioed headquarters that night. The line crackled to life through static. This is Rivers at Holosite 4. I'm initiating Recovery Protocol 2. Copy that, Rivers. Status of the specimen. Adult female. Deep laceration. Stabilized. Mobile, but weak. Cub is healthy. Behaviorally. Bonded. Zero aggression. There was a pause. Transport planned? Not yet, Annie said. I want to evaluate further. Behavior is unique. Meaning. She hesitated. Then, the cub won't leave her side. I've never seen anything like it. I think we need to let them stay. Here a little longer. You sure that's not sentiment talking? Annie looked down at the cub, who had lifted his head from his mother's flank to watch her as she spoke. No, she said softly. It's science, and something else. Days passed. The bears began to move together, slow laps across the room, their coordination improving. The cub would test new corners, sniff at the door. Once, he tried pawing at the window glass and seemed confused when his claws made no difference. Annie laughed quietly, then caught herself. They had become a rhythm. Eat, rest, heal, repeat. Annie never played music. She never raised her voice. Everything in the cabin softened to accommodate the fragile gravity of what lived here now. She found herself talking to them. Food's ready, she'd say, scooping broth into the dishes. Or, you've got new gauze today. Go easy on me. The cub began to respond to her voice. He didn't understand the words, of course, but he understood her presence, her intention. And when the mother bear began to limp toward the fire on her own, the cub stayed with her, pressing close, always, close. Still her shadow, still the heartbeat beside her own. One night, the storm came, a true blizzard. Winds screaming down from the peaks, battering the forest like a siege. The snow turned sideways, white and angry. Trees bowed. The cabin groaned against the force of it. Inside, the bears huddled together. Annie sat cross-legged beside the fire, flashlight tucked in the crook of her neck, writing in her journal. She didn't hear the cub approach until she felt the warmth. He pressed himself against her knee, just briefly, just a heartbeat. Then he was gone, back to his mother's side. But it was enough. It was a thank you. It was, you are part of this now. Annie didn't sleep that night. The wind howled. The windows shook. The roof creaked ominously, but inside, something steady held. 3 lives, stitched together not by design, but by need, and maybe by something deeper, something wild and wordless, something like love. The days stretched long in silence. Outside, the snow climbed past the windows, burying the bottom panes in white. Every sound was muffled by the cold. The crack of ice shifting on the lake, the soft sigh of branches letting go beneath fresh weight. The wind no longer screamed. It whispered. It hummed through the trees like a lullaby sung by something too old to remember the words. Inside the cabin, the rhythm had settled into something almost sacred. Each morning, Annie rose before the sun, made coffee thick and dark, and stood at the window watching the pale blue light rise over the ridge. She checked the generator, made notes in her logbook, and tended to the bears. She no longer thought of them as the bears, not really. The cub was still nameless, but she thought of him now as the little one. Or sometimes, when he did something, bold or foolish, like dragging her glove into the corner of the room and pretending it was a predator to pounce on, she simply called him Trouble. The mother had grown stronger. Her limp was still noticeable, but her weight distribution had evened out. She could now cross the cabin without faltering, and had even begun pawing gently at the door when she needed to relieve herself. Annie would clear a small area outside with a shovel, stand at a safe distance, and watch her lumber through the snow with slow but determined steps. Each time she returned to the warmth of the fire, her breath steaming in the cold, the cub ran, to meet her, sniffing her face, circling her feet. He didn't understand distance yet. He only knew closeness. Annie documented everything. The cub's sleeping patterns, the bear's wound healing in phases, granulation, scabbing, regrowth, the way their interactions shifted by degrees, how the cub had begun mimicking the mother's postures, from head tilt to breathing rhythms. She was imprinting on him again, not just through scent and presence, but through motion, through the quiet things wild creatures teach their young without ever making a sound. She watched one afternoon as the mother taught the cub to dig. They were in the cleared patch outside the cabin, the sun casting gold through the pines. The cub had pawed at a crust of snow and backed off when his nails hit ice. The mother leaned forward, nudged the spot, then began to dig, slow and methodical, her massive paws churning up packed snow until the earth peeked through. The cub watched, then tried. His form was clumsy, but he kept at it, looking back at her for reassurance, even when she didn't make a sound. That's how it went with wild things. No praise, no correction, only demonstration and trust. At night, Annie would sit with her journal beside the stove and try to put it all into words. But the words failed her more often than not. What could she write that would matter? That a bear had looked her in the eye? That a cub had pressed against her leg as the storm screamed? That in the breath between heartbeats she had found something she didn't even know she'd lost? She didn't know how to measure that. So instead she wrote. Day 26. Behavior normalized. Cub initiates play and mimicry. Adult bear tracking me with interest but no aggression. Wound is healing well. I don't think they're afraid of me anymore. That's not science. That's something else. In the stillness, Annie found pieces of herself again. She'd forgotten how much of her had frayed in the last few years. Before this winter, she'd been coasting on habit, research gigs, fieldwork, presentations given to half-listening crowds. People liked the way she spoke, direct, clinical, sharp. But she'd grown weary of explaining the wild to people who didn't want to understand it, who thought conservation meant fences and funding instead of silence and presence. She'd watched entire ecosystems be dissected into bullet points. She'd felt herself becoming one too, but here, in this cabin, there were no PowerPoints, no Q&As, no need to justify the worth of a creature based on its role in a food web. There was just healing, and the sound of paws moving across wood, and the sight of a cub resting his chin on his mother's back, eyes half-lidded with trust. One morning, Annie woke to the sound of movement, not the soft padding of the cub or the deliberate thump of the mother bear. This was different, faster, sharp. She sat up, heart already rising into her throat, and reached for her boots. Outside the cabin, the trees stood frozen, branches heavy with snow. The wind was calm, but she heard it again. Movement across the north ridge. Something running. Then gunshots, 2 sharp cracks that shattered the quiet like breaking glass. Annie froze. Her mind turned cold. Poachers. She hadn't seen any signs recently, but that didn't mean they weren't there. And now the bears were here, in the open, vulnerable. She moved fast, pulled on her parka, loaded the tranquilizer rifle, checked the fuel in the snowmobile. She didn't plan to use any of it, but she needed to be ready. The cub sensed her tension before she spoke. He stood near the door, ears high, body low to the ground. The mother bear was alert, her breathing quicker, eyes darting. Annie raised, her voice gently but clearly. "Not a threat to us," she said. "Not yet. But we need to be smart." She stayed close to the cabin that day, didn't leave the perimeter, kept the bears inside. The cub scratched at the door once, whining softly. Annie knelt beside him, hand resting near his paw, but not touching. "Not today, little one." The gunshots didn't come again, but they hung in the air, echoes threading through every breath. Annie filed a report over radio, alerting rangers in the area, but she knew how slow the system was out here. The wild moved faster than bureaucracy. She sat up late that night, watching the fire burn low, watching the bears sleep. The cub twitched in his dreams, tiny paws moving like he was running. The mother let out a soft, guttural snore, a sound deeper than sleep. Annie leaned back in her chair and whispered, "I won't let anyone hurt you." It wasn't a promise she knew how to keep. But she made it anyway. And in the heart of the cabin, surrounded by wood and fur and firelight, the words felt real. The storm had passed, but the quiet stayed. Annie found herself moving through the days, with a softness she hadn't known she possessed. Her steps were lighter, her breath slower. Her words, when she used them, seemed meant more for the air than for any living ear. The bears moved like shadows through the cabin now. The mother's wound had healed into a thick scar along her flank, fur beginning to regrow in wiry tufts. She no longer limped, at least not obviously, and she moved with a silent dignity that reminded Annie of old trees, the kind that didn't bend even when snow buried their branches. The cub had grown. It surprised her at first, how fast it happened. A few weeks ago, he could curl entirely beneath the work table. Now, he stretched halfway across the space in front of the fire. His legs were longer, his claws sharper, his energy boundless. He'd taken to exploring every corner of the cabin. He learned quickly which drawers held food, which doors led outside, and which creaked when nudged too hard. He nosed open the closet once and emerged wearing an old fishing net like a scarf. Annie had laughed so hard she'd scared herself. He blinked at her as if to say, "What? I'm fabulous." The laughter came like a rush, raw and sudden, and echoed in her chest long after the sound faded. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she'd heard herself laugh. By mid-February, the snow began to melt in tiny fractures. Icicles thinned on the eaves. Water ran in slow trickles down the bark of the pines. And with the thaw, something shifted in the mother bear. She began to watch the windows more. Her eyes lingered on the door. Her body moved with restless precision. She was remembering, and the forest was calling her back. Annie knew this part would come. She'd always known. Bears aren't meant to live in cabins, not even warm ones. But knowing didn't make it easier. She began preparations quietly, gathering maps, checking trails, inspecting the old sled. She reread her notes on rewilding procedures, updating the files with details specific to the pair. Reintroduction site, TBD. Time frame, 2 to 3 weeks post-recovery. Condition, favorable, behavioral bond, strong, risk of separation, high. She wrote those words like numbers in a ledger, like facts, like protocol. But each line carried a weight she didn't want to name. One morning, she found the cub perched at the edge of the porch, snow dusting his fur like stars. He was watching the tree line, still, unmoving. His ears twitched once when she stepped outside. "You see something?" she asked softly. He didn't look at her, just kept staring. Then, slowly, he turned and padded back inside. They had a few more good days, quiet ones, days filled with melted snow and long walks around the perimeter. Annie never strayed far from the cabin, and neither did the bears. But each time they stepped into the woods, the mother walked a little farther. The cub followed her every time. He didn't glance back at Annie the way he used to. Not as often, not as much, and that hurt in ways she didn't let herself explore. She scheduled the rewilding for the first week of March, Valen's Ridge, 100 miles from the cabin, secluded, untouched, no logging roads, no campsites, no cell towers, just trees and wind and time. She'd seen it years ago and marked it on a map with a red circle. Now it called to her too. The final part of her job. Letting go. The day before departure, she couldn't sleep. She paced the cabin, journal in hand, rereading her notes. Cub shows signs of independence, tracks mother closely, initiates play but increasingly mimics adult behaviors, scent marking, mock hunting, den digging. She stopped writing halfway through the line, set the pencil down, looked at the bears curled near the stove. They looked like a single form, pressed together, like a shape carved from silence and survival. "I hope the wild is ready for you," she whispered. She didn't say what she really meant. "I hope I'm ready to let you go." The morning of the journey came grey and cold. She sedated the mother gently. Not enough to knock her out, just enough to ease the ride. The cub sniffed at the needle when she withdrew it. He didn't growl. He didn't run. He just stared at her, long and slow, and let out a soft grunt, as if to say, "I know this means something." She packed them onto the sled, layering blankets and waterproof tarp, secured them carefully, checked the snowmobile, checked again, then paused at the door. One last glance at the cabin, the scratch marks on the table leg, the folded blanket near the stove, the floorboard where the cub used to paw at shadows. She closed the door behind her, gently, like closing the last page of a chapter she wasn't ready to end. The ride to Valen's Ridge took 5 hours. Rough terrain, low visibility. Her fingers were numb by the end, her breath sharp in her throat. But she made it. The ridge stood wide and wind-carved, trees, stretched tall like cathedral arches. A glacial stream cut across the western edge, and patches of early green peeked from beneath the snow. Perfect. She lowered the sled, unwrapped the bears. The cub stirred first, lifted his head, sniffed the air, took 2 steps toward the trees, then stopped, turned back, looked at her. His breath puffed into the cold. She knelt beside him, didn't touch, just breathed with him. For a moment they shared that breath. One last heartbeat between 2 lives forever changed. Then he turned, walked back to his mother, who had begun to rise, and together they moved into the trees. No fanfare, no drama, just paws pressing prints into snow. The path back to wild. Annie stayed until nightfall, didn't move, didn't cry. Not yet. Only when the wind picked up and carried the faintest sound, something between a grunt and a chuff, did she close her eyes and let herself feel the goodbye. The cabin was too quiet, not silent. There was always some sound in these woods. The creak of timber settling into frost, the tick of the stove, the distant whine of wind moving through frozen pine. But this was a different kind of quiet, a hollowing one, the kind that comes when something important has left, and the space it used to fill hasn't learned how to close around the absence. Annie hadn't realized how much noise the bears had made. It wasn't just the sounds of their bodies, claws on floorboards, huffs in their sleep, the occasional clatter of a pot knocked over by the cub's curiosity. It was their presence. The sense that life breathed thick and warm between these four walls. That something wild, something wounded and healing, had trusted this place enough to rest here. Now, that breath was gone, and the air felt thinner. She spent the first few days cleaning. It gave her hands something to do, something to hold, while the ache behind her sternum found its rhythm. She scrubbed the floors, laundered the blankets, repacked the medical kits, organized the tool cabinet. She stripped the bedding where the mother had lain and stood a long time staring at the impression in the padding, the dent where the cub used to curl. She washed it anyway, folded it tight, placed it in storage, but her hands trembled the whole time. The wildlife survey continued. Work didn't stop for heartbreak. Each morning, Annie strapped on her boots and hiked the perimeter of her sector. She checked the trail cams, logged new prints in the snow, noted scat samples, marked recent kills from predator activity, scanned for signs of shifting pack territory. It helped, sort of. The data offered her a language she knew how to speak. Columns, numbers, percentages, behavior analysis, predator-prey density ratios, statistical models, cold facts. They didn't break your heart. Not the way a cub's soft breath on your boot did. She thought she saw them once, 2 weeks after the release. She was hiking near a ridgeline just beyond Bear's Hollow, a cliff edge that overlooked the valley where she'd left them. Movement caught her eye, low to the ground, fast, brown fur flashing through snow-dusted underbrush. She froze, waited. The shape emerged, a bear cub just beyond sapling height, nose to the ground, pouring through the remnants of a frozen stump. Then another shape, a larger one, rose from behind the rocks, tall and strong and unmistakably maternal. Annie didn't move. She didn't breathe. The wind shifted, and the larger bear lifted her head, sniffing. Their eyes met. A heartbeat stretched so long it felt like the wind held still. Then the mother turned, slow and sure, and disappeared back into the trees. The cub followed, but not before looking back. Just once. Annie stood in that spot until the sun dipped behind the trees, painting the snow in ribbons of gold and violet. She didn't chase them. She didn't try to track. She knew better. Wild things are not meant to be called back. You don't own them, not even when they've slept beneath your roof. That night, she sat by the fire with her journal in her lap. She flipped to the last page of field notes, then passed them, to the blank back cover, no graphs, no data, just open paper. She wrote, "They remembered," and that's enough. I don't need more than that. I don't need to be a part of their story anymore. But they will always be part of mine. Spring came in fits and starts. The snow melted, like a secret, slow and hesitant. The rivers cracked open with groans that echoed through the valleys. The sun found new ways to touch the forest, warmer now, less afraid. And life moved. Elk herds began their migrations. Wolves followed, distant but sure. The first birds returned, robins, then swallows, then the early warblers whose songs fell like questions from the trees. And Annie kept walking, kept logging, but something in her had changed. She started to linger longer in places she once passed by. A bend in the river where the cub once tried to catch floating leaves. A hollow tree where she once found him wedged, stuck in stubborn determination and too much fluff. A rise of stone near the cabin where the mother had laid her head on a warm afternoon. Eyes closed, but ears alert. She stood in those places with her palms open and her thoughts quiet. And in those silences, something new began to root itself in her chest. Not grief, not longing. Gratitude. She found a track one morning clear as a photograph. Small bare paw, fresh, pressed into a patch of thawed earth beside the creek. It was deeper than it should have been. Heavier, not a cub anymore. She traced it with a finger, smiling softly. "He's growing," she murmured. She didn't take a picture, didn't log it. Some things weren't for the report. In April, a letter arrived at the station, forwarded from her department back in Anchorage. It was from a third grade class who had read her original report as part of a Guardians of the Wild education initiative. They had questions. Lots of them. Did the cub ever smile? She laughed at that one. Was he scared of the snow? Did he ever sleep on her bed? She nearly choked on her tea. One letter stood out. A child had drawn two bears, a big one and a small one, curled together in front of a campfire. Off to the side was a figure in a parka, holding a steaming mug. The caption read, "She made them safe, so they could go home." Annie folded the drawing and placed it inside the back cover of her journal. She didn't say anything for a long time after. That just watched the snow melt outside the window, the river gleaming with the gold of a new sun. The forest had changed. Annie noticed it in small ways first. The way the pine needles fell heavier after the rain, the way birdsong drifted slower across the clearing. Spring had finally broken winter's hold, but it did so like an apology. Nothing burst forth with urgency. Everything unfolded cautiously, as though the land itself remembered the snow's weight and wasn't sure it had truly gone. She understood that feeling. It had been 6 weeks since she let the bears go. 6 weeks since she watched them vanish into the folds of Valen's Ridge like breath into mist. She still hadn't heard a single update from the main office about follow-ups or tracking hits, which meant one of two things. Either they hadn't strayed close enough to human activity to be picked up, or they were already fully rewilded, moving, like ghosts, unseen and unbothered. Either way, it was good news. It should have brought peace, but the quiet was beginning to press in. Annie had always been solitary by design. Even as a child, she preferred the edges of things. The corner of the classroom, the back of the library. Her science fair project in 5th grade had been a 3D model of a wolfpack's hunting formation. While the other kids made volcanoes and solar systems, Annie had drawn paw prints and labelled every limb on a cardboard elk. She didn't mind being alone, until now. Now it felt less like solitude and more like absence. She found herself reaching for sounds that didn't come. Tiny claws, scratching at wood, a low grunt from the corner, the thump of a cub tumbling into something he shouldn't have. The forest was full of life, but none of it moved the same way. She kept working. That was the rule. She hiked, measured, filed reports, adjusted trail cams. She tracked wolf scat for a full 3 miles along a river bend and mapped migration patterns in a spreadsheet that glowed too white on her laptop. But something in her hands had gone numb. Not from cold, from disconnection. She stopped by the cabin less and less. Instead, she started wandering farther from base camp, taking her gear on longer treks, setting up tents where the soil felt warm, beneath her boots. She would pitch camp near streams or ridges, sometimes staying 2 or 3 days in the same place, waiting for signs. Not data points, not loggable movements. Something else, something familiar. She wasn't sure what she was looking for until the day she saw the scratch marks. They were faint, nearly lost in bark shadow, but they were there, on the western face of a cedar tree just below Valen's Ridge. 3 vertical lines, evenly spaced, deep enough to be recent. Too high for a fox, too clean for a black bear cub. She placed her hand over them, palm flat, fingers spread, still warm, from the sun. She looked around, quiet, still, and smiled. She returned to the cabin that evening, lit the fire, left the lanterns off, and sat in the dark, the flickering light casting memory shapes on the walls. She poured a cup of tea and reached. For her journal wrote, "I saw signs today, not in the charts, not on the cams. In the way the tree still breathes after being touched. I think they're still near, and I think they remember. Or maybe I just want to. The next day, she ventured back out. The weather had turned warmer still, enough for the rivers to run high and fast, and for the scent of thawed earth to rise up like a living thing. She followed the ridge west, past the cedar tree, across a shallow ravine where fallen branches formed a crude bridge. There were tracks there, not fresh, but recent. A small bear, larger than a cub, not quite an adult. The paw prints were longer, now more sure. The stride had changed, no longer meandering, purposeful, and beside them, briefly, faintly, larger tracks. The mother, still together, still moving as one. She knelt, hands trembling, and brushed snow away from one. Then she whispered, something she hadn't said aloud in years. Thank you. That night, the dreams came. They weren't like the ones she used to have, the clinical stress dreams of missed deadlines and lost data files. These were warmer, stranger. She stood in the cabin, only it wasn't the cabin. It was something older, woven from roots and stone, lit by firelight that pulsed like breath. The cub was there, larger now, sitting across from her. He didn't speak, but she understood him anyway. He said, "You stayed." She woke with tears on her cheeks. A week later, the letter came, not from the agency, not from any wildlife board, from a small independent researcher in the lower 48. Someone she didn't know. Someone who had read her rewilding report online and sent a typed letter with a handwritten postscript. The letter was brief, respectful, curious. The postscript said, "I had a mountain lion once, injured, rehabilitated. I let her go. She came back once, sat on my roof for an hour, just watched. Then she was gone. I think some animals leave a piece of themselves with us. I think they take a piece too. You wrote about that without saying it. Thank you." Annie folded the letter, taped it inside her journal, opposite the child's drawing. Later, that day, she climbed to the outcrop overlooking Valen's ridge. She sat in the same spot where she'd watched them disappear, and this time, she didn't cry. She just listened, to the wind, to the river, to the sound the forest makes when it remembers something important. Rain came before dawn. Not the gentle kind that teased petals from hiding, but the steady, weighty kind. The kind that reminded the earth of its own roots. It fell in silver sheets against the cabin roof, splattering the windows in slow-moving beads. The sound filled every corner of the space, soothing in its consistency, like the steady breath of a sleeping animal beside you. Annie woke slowly, cocooned in layers of wool and cotton, the air still warm from the fire she'd banked the night before. The familiar creak of expanding floorboards met her ears as the wood adjusted to moisture and heat. It was the kind of morning that begged for slowness. But the forest wouldn't wait. Even in rain, the wild moved. Especially in rain. By mid-morning, she had her boots on and her coat zipped to the chin. She left the stove, humming behind her, and stepped into a world painted in grey-green. The pines dripped steadily. The sky was a uniform curtain of cloud, and the earth beneath her feet had softened, turned to sponge and mud and memory. She headed northwest, toward the valley rim, toward Valen's ridge. She didn't have a reason, not one she could name, but her body moved with purpose, legs remembering a trail her mind hadn't mapped. She was beginning to trust that feeling. The forest welcomed her with a hush. She didn't see the bears that day, but the land had stories. A half-dug den in the soft, earth beneath a leaning fir, claw marks on the bark of a fallen spruce, the sap still fresh around the edges, and a torn patch of soil where something large had bedded down during the last storm. She crouched beside it, running her fingers along the indentations, the depressions where shoulders and hips had pressed. It was wide, large enough for two. She smiled. "They were here," she whispered, and for a moment the wind shifted, brushing her cheek like breath. Back at the cabin that night, she didn't light the lanterns. She let the dark come gently. She sat in front of the fire and opened the blank journal she'd been saving. A new one. The first page was crisp and waiting. She wrote, "The forest doesn't speak in words. It speaks in pauses, in what doesn't move. I'm learning to listen to that." The following week brought change. The last of the snow retreated from the ridgelines. The rivers ran high and fast, pulling winter down to lower valleys. Small bursts of green poked through last year's decay, ferns unfurling, moss reclaiming bark, and the animals returned. Marten tracks near the creek, elk on the high trail, red fox darting between shadow and sunlight, fur brilliant against the melt. But Annie wasn't looking for them. She was looking for the quiet between those moments. That's where the truth lived now. She found something strange one morning. A pile of stones, not natural, arranged in a ring, just off the main game trail west of Bear Hollow. It looked like something had moved them deliberately. She crouched near it. They were small, rounded river rocks, 5 of them, placed in a rough circle with a hollow in the center. Bare, earth, slightly depressed, too large for birds to nest in, too orderly for wind, not recent, not fresh. She touched one stone, smooth, warm from the morning sun. "Why here?" she murmured. The forest didn't answer. But as she stood, she saw it, just beyond the next rise. Another print, clear, deep. The mother. And beside it, fainter, smaller, pressed into moss but unmistakable. The cub, still following, still learning. She returned to the cabin and built a small replica of the stone ring on the shelf above the fire. She didn't know why, only that it felt like a language she hadn't learned yet, but one she was beginning to understand. That night, something strange happened. She dreamed again. The cabin, but changed. The walls were thicker, closer. The air full of smoke and pine and something older than memory. The fire was burning low, and in the corner, 2 shapes, watching. She didn't move, didn't speak. But her hand rose, almost involuntarily, and pointed to the door. Open. The wind rushed in, and the shapes vanished. When she woke, her skin was cold, but her chest was warm. She began spending more time by the river. She brought no equipment, no field guides, no tools, just herself and the silence. She sat for hours, legs drawn up, watching the water run. She'd never done this before. Not really. She'd always studied the river, measured it, tested it, written about its flow rate and sediment and temperature change, but now she just let it exist, and in doing so, let herself do the same. A month passed. May came in bursts of birdsong and wind, and then, without warning, she saw him. The cub, not a cub anymore. He was taller now, leaner. His coat was darker, cleaner, his gait stronger. He stood across the stream, nose high, body still. Annie froze. They stared at each other for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than seconds. They asked if she'd consider it. She said she'd think about it. But the moment she hung up the satellite phone, she knew her answer. She just didn't want to say it yet. She walked for hours that evening, past the river, up through the birch trail that curved toward the high ridge, the one she'd only hiked twice before. The first time, she'd been chasing signs of a moose herd. The second, she'd needed to clear her head after an argument with her grant supervisor about radio collars. This time, she didn't need a reason. Only air. Only sky. At the top, the land fell away like an open palm. The forest stretched forever, and for a moment, she could see it all. Where the bears had gone, where the wolves had scattered, where her own footprints wove patterns she could no longer trace. She sat on the edge of a flat boulder and watched the sun begin to fall. It painted the world in gold, then rose, then fire. And as the shadows grew longer, she opened her journal and wrote, "I used to think maps told you where you were going. But maybe the best ones only show you where you've been. The rest, you walk blind." but not lost. The next day, she packed a small satchel, no gear, no tools, only a carved wooden figure, simple, unpainted, a bear and a cub. Two shapes joined at the side, faceless but full of meaning. She'd whittled it months ago, during a rainstorm that kept her inside for 2 days. She hadn't known then why she made it. Now she did. She hiked north, toward a stretch of land no one monitored. No trails, no tags, only silence. She moved slow, careful, not because she feared danger, because the ground felt sacred, like walking through the last pages of a book you didn't want to end. At a bend in the trail, beside a creek so narrow it whispered, instead of sang, she found a clearing. Untouched, woven with dappled light and moss. She didn't speak, didn't move for a long while. When the moment felt right, she placed the carved figure at the base of a pine tree with bark worn smooth on one side. No inscription, no markers, just presence. Then she walked away. August rolled in on a warm breeze. The field station requested her final reports. She submitted them in full, 37 pages, photos, tracking data, behavioral analysis, recovery success rates. A perfect package, neat, clinical. She left out the parts that mattered, the dreams, the way the forest watched her sometimes, the sound the cub had made the first night he curled beside her leg. She kept those, filed under, unmeasurable. On the last morning of the season, she stood at the window of the cabin and looked out over the clearing. It looked the same, but she didn't. She was no longer the woman who came here to escape noise and people. She was the one who had knelt in the snow beside a dying bear. The one who had carried 2 lives across a frozen ridge because she couldn't bear the thought of one little heart breaking alone. The one who had stayed. And in doing so, had been rewritten. The department called again. "Any updates on the job?" She answered without hesitation. "I'm staying." A pause on the line. "You mean for another season?" "I mean, I'm staying." That night, she lit a fire, made tea, and opened the first page of a new journal. She didn't title it, didn't date it. She simply wrote, "Some homes aren't built, they're found. And when you find them, the wild knows your name and whispers it, Ack." The first storm of August came sudden and hard. It arrived like an ambush. No whisper of warning, no build-up of distant clouds. One moment, the sky was clear, the air dry with sun. The next, a wall of wind slammed through the valley, tearing branches from trees and hurling rain sideways in torrents. Annie was already halfway up the eastern slope when it hit. She'd been hiking out to reset a faulty trail cam and track signs of early migration. But within minutes, visibility dropped to feet. Trees bowed, groaned. The rain hit so thick it felt like drowning while standing. She took cover beneath a sloped ridge of rock, an overhang shaped by time and water, barely wide enough to crouch beneath. Her coat soaked through in minutes. Cold crept into her bones, despite the season. But none of that was what made her heart beat too loud in her ears. It was the tracks. Fresh, half-washed, but visible, right there in the mud. Bear and cub, only they weren't small anymore. She knelt, fingers trembling, tracing the shape she could now identify instantly. These weren't the tracks of strangers. These were familiar, marked by a slight curve in the left forepaw, a deeper print on the right hind. She remembered. He was still here, still alive, still moving, and perhaps still watching. The storm passed quickly. As suddenly as it came, the sky cleared, the wind dropped, and the rain became mist. Then memory. Annie emerged into a dripping world. Everything, shining under a sheet of silver light. She followed the prints a while, heart still hammering. They vanished eventually, into harder terrain, over rock, no point chasing further. She stood there a long time, not because she was lost, because she'd been found. That night, she returned to the cabin in silence. She didn't write in her journal. She didn't need to. She felt him. The memory of his breath near her leg, the soft grunt, the unblinking stare that said, "I'm not leaving." And now, his prints, still tracing the same trails she walked. Somehow, their lives had continued to thread together, invisible, unplanned, unbroken. The next few days passed in golden heat. Summer in the north had a way of pressing itself into your skin, not with warmth, but with stillness. Everything held its breath this time of year. The forest was at its loudest, birds, insects, frogs, all competing in an ancient chorus. But underneath the noise was a hush, a readiness, as if the land knew what came next and was trying to savor what remained. Annie moved with reverence. Every step felt sacred. Every footfall on moss or pine needle bed felt like pressing into memory. On the third day she found the feather. Not unusual in itself. She found feathers all the time, but this one was placed. Not dropped, not blown by wind. It lay atop a small stone on the trail behind her cabin, perfectly balanced, dark grey, almost black with a white tip. She stared at it, and her whole body went still. The stone it sat on wasn't natural either, not part of the trail. It had been placed. She knelt slowly, didn't touch it, didn't move it, only breathed and whispered, "I see you." The wind stirred the trees behind her. A pine cone fell. Nothing else moved. She left the feather where it was. The next morning, it was gone. That week, the dreams returned, more vivid than before. Not metaphor, not symbol. She was walking through the woods as herself in silence. Then he was there. The cub, not cub anymore, taller than her waist, his eyes amber in the firelight, filtering through branches. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He stepped closer, placed his forehead gently against hers. A single moment, then turned and vanished into mist. She woke with tears in her hairline and a sense of warmth curling in her ribs. It was time to do something she'd avoided for months. She opened the envelope on her desk, the one from the Conservation Board. It contained a survey form, standard post-recovery. Questionnaire for rewilded specimens. Optional. Mostly used for data improvement. She hadn't filled it out. Now she did, but not with answers they expected. Question 1. Did the subject reintegrate into the wild environment successfully? Annie wrote, "Yes, and so did I." Question 2. Were there signs of continued human imprint behavior? She paused, then wrote, "He remembered, but he stayed wild." That's not a failure, that's grace. Question 3. Would you consider the rewilding a success? She hesitated longer this time. Then, beneath the printed lines, she wrote in the margin, "Success isn't survival. It's choosing to stay close to something when you could run." He stayed, so did I. That's the whole story. She didn't send the form in. Instead, she folded it carefully, tucked it inside her journal, and added a new page behind it. On it, she drew a map. Not one with coordinates or trail markers, but one with memories. A circle for the cabin, a loop for the bear's release, a star for the ridge where she saw him last, a pine tree drawn in the margins with a white-tipped feather resting at its base. No words, just images. A map for no one, but real all the same. She began leaving the cabin unlocked. She didn't know why. She wasn't expecting anyone, but sometimes, just before sleep, she would hear the faintest creak of the porch. No footsteps, no growls, just the air shifting, and she would smile. Because some stories don't end with a goodbye. They end with a return. Even if you never see it, even if all that remains is the feeling. He was here. The river had changed its sound. It was subtle, but Annie noticed. The pitch had softened, rounded with warmth, like the water was carrying less ice and more memory now. It no longer whispered warnings. It hummed, low and easy, like the land had finally decided to breathe again. She sat at its edge, journal closed beside her, fingers dipped in the current. For weeks now, she'd walked without purpose. Not out of aimlessness, but something quieter, a kind of listening. She wasn't tracking anything, not anymore. She wasn't measuring prints or following scat or cataloguing tree damage. She was just here. There was power in that. She'd begun to notice things she never had before. How the grass leaned slightly east in the mornings. How a squirrel's warning chirp changed tone depending on the kind of predator overhead. How the deer always paused before stepping into shadow, like they were asking permission. She wondered if she should start writing about that. Not for the field office, for herself. The science was still there. It always would be. But she was beginning to understand that some of the most important things weren't measurable. Some truths arrived without a sound, like the print she'd found that morning. A single paw, bare, mature, clear as ink against the clay just upstream. Not alone. A second print, smaller, had been beside it. The edges had already begun to soften with time, but Annie had known. It was them, still moving together, still walking the ridge she once led them across. They hadn't left. Not really. Neither had she. The first fire of fall came early. Annie hadn't planned to light it yet. The days were still, long, the air still warm in the afternoons. But that morning, a wind had swept down from the north, not cold enough to bite, but sharp enough to remind. Seasons were shifting. She built the fire slowly, deliberately. Each log placed with care, not just for heat, for memory, for ritual. The cabin filled with that scent she loved. Smoke, pine, old paper. The kind of smell that made you feel like you'd done something right just by being there. She sat beside it for hours, not reading, not writing, just listening to the crackle and the rustle of leaves outside. Occasionally, a bird would dart past the window, a flash of wing in gold light. The forest was beginning to turn, and so was she. She'd started sleeping with the windows open again, letting the night air in, letting the wild sounds fold around her like a blanket. Sometimes, in that in-between place just before sleep, she would imagine she heard it. The faint huff of a bear, the shuffle of paws near the porch. She never checked. Some things didn't need proving. Some things were real just because you felt them. She still walked every day, still left small things in quiet places. A pine cone, a smooth stone. Once she tucked a tuft of her own hair into a knot in a tree, laughing to herself as she did. "Now I'm part of the forest too," she'd whispered. One evening, she found something new. At the edge of the lake, where the cattails swayed and frogs waited out the heat, someone, or something, had drawn in the mud. Not with claws, not with tools, just a shape, a circle, incomplete. Rough, but unmistakable. She crouched, heart thudding softly. Not fear, wonder. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small carved figure she'd been carrying for weeks. Not a bear, not a wolf. A woman, standing with arms outstretched. She placed it beside the circle, then stood, and left it there. The frost returned in whispers. It didn't arrive in a storm, didn't crash through the valley with noise and fury. It crept in, quiet, patient. It kissed the edges of leaves, traced its fingers along the window glass, curled beneath the cabin door like breath from an old ghost. Annie woke to find the grass silvered, each blade standing stiff with cold. The river steamed in the early light. Birds sang less now, not because they were gone, but because they were listening too. Everyone was waiting. She made tea that morning instead of coffee, the kind her mother used to drink, black, strong, steeped until bitter. The smell filled the cabin, grounding and strange. Her boots were heavy, but she didn't mind. She was used to carrying things now, She walked south toward the lower glade, an old clearing where the deer moved like shadows and the trees leaned in, whispering. Secrets too old to translate. It was a place of stillness. Today, though, it wasn't empty. They were there. The bears. Just for a moment. Just far enough away that she might have imagined them. But she didn't. She knew that shape. The rise of the mother's shoulders as she moved. The way the younger one, no longer a cub, held his head, proud and alert, as though the whole forest answered to him. He looked right at her, didn't move, didn't run. Annie didn't raise a hand, didn't speak. She just stood and breathed. After a few heartbeats, they turned, vanished into trees so slowly it felt like a dream pulling away at the edge of waking. But the prince remained, pressed into soft earth like a message. Still here, still near. Annie sat down where they'd stood. She didn't cry. She smiled, because this wasn't the end. It never had been. Snow came again, soft and slow. Not the kind that buried things, the kind that revealed them. It dusted, the ground like ash, caught in the creases of branches, laid quiet over the roof of the cabin. The world felt paused, held, like it was waiting to see what Annie would do next. She wasn't afraid of winter anymore. She wasn't afraid of silence either. The cabin, once a place of isolation, had become something else, a node in the web of the wild, not separate from the forest, but stitched into it. A part of the map the bears followed, a shape remembered. That morning, she stood at the window and watched the light arrive. It broke slowly, first in pale blue streaks, then soft gold spilling across the snow. A single jay landed on the porch railing, watched her for a beat, then flew on. She stepped outside with her mug, steam rising into the cold. Footprints led away from the steps, not bear, wolf, 3 sets. She smiled. "Still checking in, huh?" she said. No reply, of course. But it was enough. She sat on the porch for a long time, letting the heat from her cup warm her hands, watching the wind lift snowflakes into the air like sparks. She opened her journal. Not the first, not the second, new one. The cover was blank, the pages untouched. She wrote, "The wild remembers, and so do I. It doesn't need a witness, but I stayed. So I saw, so I knew, so I became part of it for a little while. And when they come again, bear or wolf or wind, I will be ready. I will open the door. I will say, welcome home."